Sorry?
Can I use this?
Yes?
Can we just check that we're about to start? Can we just check that we have translation, please?
You have interpretation, sir.
Okay. 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 Are you speaking Turkish? Are you speaking Turkish? Is good?
Yeah, it's good. It's fine.
Okay. Okay. Saygıdeğer konuşmacılar.
Distinguished participants, speakers, my name is Nihat Sümer, and I am the Deputy Vice President of the Turkish Information Society. And our topic this morning is IANA functions, NTI's stewardship transition, and ICANN's accountability process. So I declare the meeting open. So we'll first talk about NTA's transition, transition, and in the second part of the meeting, we'll talk about ICANN's accountability, and there'll be a lot of questions answered. So far, the domain and IP and protocol contents are IANA is responsible, and the national TIA will be brought into the effect, and the internet topics are taken into consideration, and input is requested. And so there are three categories technically developed, and the policies related to that are being realized outside the IANA functions. And IATF and other related bodies and ICANN supporting organizations are parties that develop these policies, and IANA reflects these to the technical body, and this ensures a uniform approach to global internet services, and this is realized through an contract between the parties. And ICANN's accountability, of course, naturally, it brings about a discussion on the accountability of ICANN. And this is in case this is not continued with the U.S. administration. And so we see ICANN focusing on how it can be strengthened. Accountability of ICANN and its development, of course, has an important role in ICANN's success. And the discussion here will entail the transformation of authority in case ICANN's contract is not renewed. And participants here will, of course, need to be very well informed about these. And the more this happens, the more successful this session will be. And as you can, as you note, the redelegation period and the rights of states and local implementations will need to be taken into consideration in today's discussion. we have distinguished experts and authorities, high-level authorities, to discuss the issues, and we'll also expect remote participants to join in the discussions. And I would like to now introduce our moderators for the two sessions, Mr. Nuclear and Mr. Matthew Hughes. And there is Ms. Susan Chermans will be the coordinator for the remote participants. Now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Matthew Shears.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to try and go quickly so we can get the community much more involved. So the approach will be I'll ask one or two defining questions to the panel, and then thereafter I'll be looking to see if you want to raise some questions. That way, then the panel can react to your questions. So that's the approach I'll take. So if you really have some burning comments or issues you'd like to raise, I encourage you to get near to a mic so that we can do that very quickly. So I start with my very first question, and I'd like to address that question to Andrew Sullivan. And what I have in mind is to have him define for us the real subject that is being discussed. In this case, what are these IANA functions and what stewardship is being discussed?
Thank you. So many of you will already be familiar with these topics, but at the risk of vast oversimplification, there are really only three things that the IANA does. It coordinates the assignment or the publication of various parameters that make things work on the internet. One set of those is the protocol parameters, and these are pieces that allow the protocols of the internet to talk to one another. Then there are internet number resources, and that's how the bits flow around on the internet, that, internet addresses and routing numbers and so on. And then finally, there are the domain names, in particular the root zone and not really any other zones, a couple of other zones, but sort of accidentally. So the root zone is the very top of the DNS tree, and these are all places that are necessary to have some basic coordination in order that the rest of the internet can work in the kind of permissionless, free, easy association way that it does. So you need this fundamental little bit of coordination. And the stewardship of that is a pretty simple thing, it seems to me. It's really just a mechanism by which we have somebody making sure that the procedures that IANA has already published about what they're going to do are followed. That's really what the NTIA's role is in all of this, in its stewardship role of the IANA function. So this is fundamentally a clerical job, which is not to say it's not important. It's super important, but it's not complicated. It's not all of the policy questions involved in those three elements. All of those policy questions are apart from this. This is really just the piece that says, okay, I've got this policy, now I need to publish this in the way that everybody can get to it on the internet. And that's what, in my view, IANA does.
Thank you very much. Still on the defining the issue we are discussing, I'd like to raise my next question to Joseph Al-Hadef, and I'd like him to share with us where we are in the process and if there are any issues we should be aware of.
Thank you. Well, perhaps, again, to restate things that a number of the people in the room may already be familiar with, perhaps it's useful to remember how we started off the process. There was the statement of transition related to the NTIA stewardship of IANA, and as we noted, there were two processes that were going to be set up, one of them related to IANA transition. As the basis of that process, there was an outreach to a broad range of communities, 13 to be exact. The communities were asked to self-organize in a way to select a representative that would participate. Each of the communities did so. In fact, on the website, you can find the methodology with which they chose their representative. So, for example, I represent ICC Basis, in the process. And while ICC Basis does have constituents who are members of ICC Basis from all of the operational communities, I'm there actually on behalf of the general business community who would see ourselves as perhaps that group of companies would be the beneficiaries of the use of the internet rather than the operational providers of the internet. And so then each of the communities has been participating through the members on the committee. The committee has already met once in London. We will be meeting tomorrow again. We have had intersessional phone calls to help move the work forward. We have appointed officers to the committee, and we have a charter and other documents which other colleagues may describe further in on the process. But I think we have developed the foundation and the framework of our operations, and the next steps will be going out to the operational communities and others related to the proposals themselves.
Thank you. Narelle, would you like to add some comments to the process?
Thank you. I think Joseph has actually stolen most of what I was about to say. So he's made my job probably easier, but probably harder. So I wanted to, I suppose, reiterate some of that we really have been in an establishment phase so far. We've simply been organising ourselves. There is no handbook for how to be how to do this particular job, how to run the most effective and well-organised, efficient, multi-stakeholder process. So we are coming together, and I'd have to say that I have a deep regard for all of the members of the ICG so far. The intelligence and expertise that has been exhibited along the way has been outstanding. So we have thus far really been working a lot on the procedural type things, getting our self-organisation going, determining whether or not we're going to go out for an independent secretariat or not, or to simply use the facilities offered kindly by ICANN. We have put out the charter. The charter is agreed. It has it went out for community comment, and we got a lot of comments from a range of people. And we've now issued what I understood to be a draft of the RFP, and we are hoping that we will get comments from the various communities as to how the request for proposal should look. So we're asking for comments on the RFP before we issue the RFP in itself. So I certainly look forward to getting some more feedback on that. At this stage, it really is going to be for us to work a lot of these things through on Saturday and also on our mailing list to take things through to the next part. Thank you.
I'd like to check whether there's any burning question from the floor so that we can get you involved much earlier. Remember, this is 2 sessions, so in a few more minutes, this particular part will be terminated. So if there are some questions, I'd like to get them from the floor now. Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was just by way of clarification. It was thought that it was important to have the RFP document out there, even though it may still be subject to change, but a number of the substantive elements were established in that document, and we think it's important for the operational communities to be able to start organizing around those substantive elements as soon as possible. So we wanted to get that document into circulation as quickly as possible, even though it may be subject to further refinement.
Thanks for the information. Still looking for questions. While we're waiting, let me throw a different question. How do you anticipate that the various parties involved in the IANA functions will be affected by the proposals that you may be expecting? And I'd like to send this to others who have not yet said anything on the panel. So, Manal, how would you respond to that?
Actually, I'm not really in a position to talk about how the IANA functions themselves are going to be affected. Probably someone from the operational communities may be in a better position to explain the current situation and how this would be affected later on. But if you allow me, I would like to, of course, no need to stress the importance of this opportunity. And I believe that we already have a great deal in common to get us started. The announcement was already welcomed by everyone. The criteria itself is already agreed by everyone. So I hope we can reach a consensus proposal in due time. I believe we only need what I may call the net mondial spirit, where all stakeholders come together committed to a timely consensus output. I also believe that we should be realistic that this output might not be identical to what each and every community has in mind as a perfect situation. So probably we need to have in mind a minimum set of requirements that could not be compromised, and a range of which could be negotiated, and a few others that may constitute our future agenda of discussions for enhancements. And finally, I would stress the importance of having everyone in the community engaged very early on, so that we can highlight any controversial issues, try to address them as early as possible, and this gives a better possibility for getting a broadly consensus proposal submitted on due time. Thank you.
Byron, how would you comment on that?
Sure. Well, maybe I'll pick up on the point of timing, and then also bring it back to the community that I'm from as an operator of a country code top-level domain and as chair of the CCNSO. And I'd just like to surface a couple of issues. And one is the tension between timing and the multi-stakeholder process itself. To put it in stark relief, we have an end date goal of September 2015. The NTIA needs the submissions by June prior to that. The ICG has asked for final inputs by December 31st, which, just to be clear, is little more than 4 months from now. And the real content work is effectively just getting started. So I think this is a very sobering and very tight timeline. And as somebody we all know, Wolfgang Klangwatscher, has said previously, the more people involved in a multi-stakeholder process, the slower it will be. And I think this is the issue that everybody in this community will be involved in. That said, I believe we are up against some political realities in the U.S., which, as most of us would know, is the coming to the end of a U.S. administration over this timeline. And late-stage U.S. administrations tend to be lame duck administrations, so significant policies getting pushed through, I think, become less and less likely. Not impossible, but with each day past the September deadline, we have to face the fact that it becomes more and more difficult. I would also just like to mention some issues around the CCTLD community in specific, but given the time right now, perhaps I'll come back to that in a moment or two.
Yes, Nara.
Thank you, Nian. Thank you, Byron. I wanted to get back to the question you just posed there, and that was, what do we think the future will be like? I think that was what it was. And what would be the impact on the operational communities in this new state? Well, at this point in time, we really don't know what that end state is going to be. It is really up to the communities to tell us what that end state should be. But if I might go back to my own background and my own position here on the ICG, and that is as the Internet Society representative. For us, we would like to see that the security and the stability of the internet be foremost and of the most importance. So in that sense, I would hope that there is minimal impact on the operational communities. These things work well. They need to continue to work well, and we need to ensure that we maintain the stability and the robust nature of the internet. So if I can go back then to Byron's point, it is essential that the communities themselves start to work through the substantive issue of how do they want the future to look like, and then they need to tell us.
There's one more person I'd like to get involved. Valentina, would you like to comment on this?
Thank you. My name is Valentina Pavel. I would like to introduce myself because to myself and to many of the people here, it's a surprise that I'm on this panel. And I'm here because I'm one of the fellows of the European School on Internet Governance. I was a fellow there, and we got to do a really nice exercise about the IANA transition. My background, I have a legal background, and I'm involved with the Association for Technology and Internet in Bucharest, Romania. It's a civil, we're an NGO focused on civil digital rights. And my comment would be, after the experience in Meissen in Germany, is that we cannot have a proper outcome for this transition if we don't look at the broader picture. And when I mention the broader picture, I mean not just looking at operations and technical functions. I mean the broader internet governance ecosystem, and even far beyond ICANN and its accountability. And this holistic approach, in my view, allows us to pose crucial questions such as, have public interests clearly been identified? Are they clearly stated? Do we have metrics about who the stakeholders are and how they are impacted? Are the terms of service in line with international human rights norms, fundamental freedoms, and democratic values? So these are the questions which are, in my view, are crucial for the IANA transition as well. And I would strongly encourage everyone not to look at only operational and implementation processes, but also at a broader picture in order to assure a great outcome for all of us.
Thanks. Having gone to law school, I feel the need to use a disclaimer. The various members of the transition coordinating group speak on behalf of their own groups. They don't speak on behalf of the group as a whole. I would say we strongly echo the comments that had been made related to the ISOC priorities. We would perhaps add one word of security, stability, and resiliency of the internet as being important. I completely understand that the issues of the much broader nature are important issues, but I'm not sure we need to answer those issues in the context of the transition. From a general business perspective, because we have such an abiding concern for the security, stability, and resiliency of the internet, we do not feel this is an appropriate time to introduce complexity into the process that wasn't there before. As was said, these organizations have an operational function. Those functions work well. If we think that there may be improvements we would like to make to the system, perhaps those are best considered post-transition, not during transition. There might be a different line of questioning related to the ecosystem that the accountability discussion, which will happen later on, works in, and obviously we are not divorced from that discussion. We are related to that discussion. In fact, in our charter, we specifically talk about the need to liaise between the IANA transition function and the ICANN accountability function. We couldn't specify how that liaising would happen because we started first, so it's difficult to liaise with what you don't know yet. But I do want to stress that I have sympathy for the desire to address those questions, but there is a time frame and a reality that we are facing that may not make that conversation able to be done in the short term.
Let me check again if there are some questions, burning questions. I mean, I really think we want to involve the community, so someone has to ask a question. Otherwise, I'll go out there myself and ask.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. My name is Naveen Tandon. I represent a global carrier association in India called ACTO, and I would request the panelists to also help clarify in terms of when this transition process will get complete, what would be the eventual structure which will come in terms of the reporting processes and the accountability part. Perhaps that has been answered, but would request if that can be helped clarified. Thank you.
I'm not sure. No, not so fast. I'm not sure we got the elements of it. We lost parts of it, so if you can go back, just so that we keep some excitement as well.
Sure. Thank you so much. So yeah. my question was more from a clarificatory point of view. In terms of when the stewardship, the transition gets complete, what would be the eventual structure which comes in terms of reporting and accountability, in terms of how it works eventually as a process? As an organization, basically, something of that sort.
I'll take a shot at that.
Sure.
And Naveen, fill in the blanks if I got the question wrong. The function of the transition group is not to create proposals, but rather to assemble a proposal from the proposals that are promulgated. And one of the things we try to do is make sure that that proposal is also meeting the conditions that were set out by NTIA as part of the transition program. Within each of the operational communities, there is already an accountability function, and we have asked them to describe those accountability functions, and I'm sure that in the community processes, people will be discussing those accountability functions. We should make very clear that the accountability functions within the operational communities are not the same thing as the discussion of the ICANN accountability function. But in fact, the ICANN accountability function is an ecosystem that is relevant to the accountability functions within the IANA transition as well. So while they are not the same topic, they are related. The answer of how they will operate, we cannot tell because we haven't seen the proposals that are coming in yet, nor do we know how the ICANN accountability function discussion will progress. But I would say that if people, to the comment that, the more multi-stakeholders you have, the slower the process may go, this is the reason that we need all stakeholders to be participating as early as possible, so we can factor the diversity of views into the process as early as possible. If people come into the process at the last minute, it will in fact derail the process. There will be cutoff points that have to be made in the real world for when a comment can and can't come in. So the communities that develop proposals will have the ability for people to participate in that proposal development. Don't wait until the proposals are submitted to the group as a whole to comment, although obviously you are welcome to comment at that point. But participate in those community development processes as well. That's the way to get ahead of the curve, and that will give us a chance of meeting the deadline.
Thank you. Any other comments on the question? Yes.
So just to illustrate the concern that some of the operational communities anyway have, I'm here because I'm the IAB's chair for the IANA program, and so we have been working on this for a little while. It so happens that we were doing a little bit of tidying beforehand, so we'd actually thought about it a little bit. And we've already got a mailing list up to talk about protocol parameters. We have a well-understood accountability framework because we have mechanisms. We have our NOMCOM, we have the mechanisms of recall and so on that work within the IETF. And we're about to charter a working group in order to yield consensus on this. and we already have a draft ready to go, so you can read this and comment on it. So I have to echo this comment. Don't wait. Now is the time. Seize this opportunity because, it's there. Anybody can participate, at least in the IETF side. Just join the mailing list. So it isn't a high barrier to entry. And, if you have strong opinions about protocol parameters, although I can't imagine why you would, because it's all working perfectly the way it is now. Therefore, we plan to document that and send it in and be ready to go by the end of the year. So I encourage everybody to, participate, keep an eye on that, and send us off in a happy way in time for the deadline.
Okay, there's a priority question on the floor.
Thank you. Since we seem to be talking about the scope of this, I'm sorry, I should introduce myself. I'm Malcolm Hutty from the London Internet Exchange. And we are a business entity. There has been discussion about whether or not the scope of this discussion should be limited to really narrowly ensuring the technical functions of the IANA can continue adequately, or whether the transition question is broader than that. Now, reading the NTIA's announcement, they say that this is about the transition for the current role played by NTIA in the coordination of the Internet's domain name system, broader than merely the IANA issue. And the NTIA says that the transition proposal must have broad community support and address the following 4 principles: to support and enhance the multi-stakeholder model, to maintain the stability and resilience of the Internet DNS, to meet the needs and expectations of global customers and partners of IANA services, and maintain the openness of the Internet. Now, my reading of this is that the transition proposal must do those things which are necessary to replace the influence that the United States has had through its special position of stewardship, in particular its ability to place the IANA contract. So I would personally not agree with those that say that this needs to be an extremely narrow discussion. Admittedly, there are aspects of accountability that ICANN should deal with in an internal fashion on an ongoing basis and at a later date. But we have a key moment now to establish the things that we need to put in place to ensure that that can happen, addressing these 4 principles. NTI has said that the transition proposal must address these principles. So if we fail to do so, we have failed to meet their expectations. Thank you.
Any comments from the panel? Oh, remote moderator. Okay. Just hold on. There's a comment from the remote moderator, so let's take that as well. Then you can react to it.
The question asks the panel to comment on how all stakeholders are being brought on the table on equal footing in this process for consultation and inputs, and the role they will be allowed to play in this decision-making process.
Let's repeat.
In relation to the IANA transition, the remote participant has requested the panel to comment on the question of how all stakeholders are being brought on the table on equal footing in this process for consultation and inputs, and the role they will be allowed to play in this decision-making process.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we have 2 questions. We'll come to you, sir. But can I take some reaction? Yes.
The panel, the coordination group, has been pretty clear that they want to assemble something from the various communities that are related to this. And they've been, and that's part of their charter. And therefore, the way that you participate has to do with how you participate in those individual communities. Each of the various kinds of communities, the names community, the internet numbers community, and the protocol parameters community, have multi-stakeholder processes. They're already developed, they're already working. And so the way you get your your views heard in those various communities is to participate there. If you have strong feelings about, in my case, internet protocol parameters, then come and join the IETF mailing list. And there are parallel processes in the various RIRs and within ICANN that are ongoing. That's the way to participate.
Thank you. And actually, I would agree with both that we need to focus and meet the deadline, and also that we need to cover as much as we can. So again, it's up to the community and the proposals that we are gonna receive from the community. I mean, if we receive proposals that covers everything and has the wide consensus of everyone in the community, then I mean, we won't cut it down, it's gonna go through. So as far as the community get engaged and agrees on whatever is being submitted, this is gonna facilitate the role that Joe has already described of assembling a final proposal from whatever we received from the community. But again, like Joseph mentioned, we shouldn't be complicating things so that we miss the deadline, because we really don't want to miss this historic opportunity. The maximum we can do but within the deadline should be our ultimate target. Thank you.
I would say that I think the issues are, number one, we need to recognize that there's a broad stakeholder group that's already represented in the transition, which includes end users, which includes businesses who are not involved in the operational, which includes a large number of various different technical functions, all of them represented in the transition group itself. Obviously, the moving the comments into the communities is the most useful way, but we have not precluded comments coming to the transition committee itself. When the proposal is being assembled, there will be the opportunity to comment directly to the transition group, so that if the work of the operational communities is too technical for the participation, there's an opportunity to deal with the proposals when they are done and being assembled. So there are many opportunities for input into the process from a broad range of stakeholders, either directly through their representatives on the committee or just directly to the committee as well.
We have two questions from the floor.
Thank you, colleagues. Good morning to all of you. My name is Araste. I'm speaking on personal capacity. With respect to the comments made, a question raised, I think the issue is quite clear. We are talking of IANA function, stewardship, transition from United States government or NTIA to global multi-stakeholder community. That's all. We are not expanding that to the internet governance and issues like that. Otherwise, the matter will be totally complicated and we never achieved anything at all. So I fully agree with Joseph and with Mana that we should retain whatever we have been given to do, have been given to discuss. No doubt governance is a very important issue, but expansion of that means that we never meet the deadline at all. This is one question and comment. Second, accountability. In the IANA function transitions stewardship, there are some degree of accountability, but it has nothing to do with the ICANN accountability. Entire two different things, and we have to distinguish that and not mix them up. Now, I come to the question now. As a participant of this meeting, I have a question. Currently, how the accountability of IANA functions is ensured or achieved in NTIA? How it is done, and then what we expect that when it is sent to the multi-stakeholder, how that accountability in that function will be achieved. So first I want to know what is the existing situation. Once I have the answer, then we set it how we should take it forward. So I hope that I would have some answer to that questions because it is very important. I think perhaps now the United States government or NTIA is accountable to itself. Thank you.
Well, I think NTI will answer that. Please, next question.
Good morning. My name is Sunil Abraham from the Center for Internet and Society in India. The question to those of the panelists with technical expertise is if they could sketch out certain scenarios where the end state to the transition undermines the security, stability, and resilience of the Internet in a little more detail. Thank you.
Yes, good morning. Khalid Fatal, Multilingual Internet Group. I won't repeat what was already mentioned, which I agree fully with the GAC representative from Iran, but I would also like to highlight two critical points. One, the deadline is more than ever critical to be delivered. Meeting the deadline in time is critical. Primarily, we need to recognize that the NTIA's decision to move into a new structure and requesting ICANN to engage the community on this came as a result of the Snowden revelations and Net Mondial. Trust is critical. Whether the proposals receive factors that will rebuild trust in the multi-stakeholder model or not, I think it's critical for those who are engaging in what processes are created to think, how do we revive or renew trust in the multi-stakeholder model so that the buy-in does not come in from those who sent in the proposals from the multi-stakeholder community, my dear ladies and gentlemen, but the buy-in comes from those who are outside it. Without that, we will still be within the same parish. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, please.
Thank you. My name is Anders Hector. I'm with the Swedish Ministry of Enterprise. I've got a really brief question. Who will be the contracting parties to the contract? And how is the process of this, how is this part of the process that is now going on? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I think we are about the end of this part of the session, and I can see from the questions are becoming more on accountability anyway. So I'm going to wind down this part of the session and ask for last comments from my colleagues here. Anyone who wants to make a comment? Yes, Manal.
I just wanted to highlight, at least for our remote question, that we are going to publish a URL that includes all the community venues where interested parties could participate and through the community processes, and this includes all the community processes that are taking place. This is going to be referenced, I think, in the RFP and also probably within the announcement. I'm not sure whether this has taken place yet, but community should stay tuned and have and start participating through the ongoing community processes. And I cannot agree more with what Khalid said regarding meeting the deadline and working to make sure we prove that the multi-stakeholder model works and delivers in this opportunity. Thank you.
Yes, Joseph.
Thanks. I think a couple of the last questions are actually the purpose of why we're together and meeting, is the process is meant to help answer those questions. So we would be incapable of answering them because the process will be generating the answers to them. To Sunil, the one thing I would say is, one of the things which the business community and a number of other communities has asked for is that as the proposals come, they should be tested and validated to the extent possible against exactly those kinds of scenarios, so that we make sure that we are not creating these opportunities to negatively impact the security, stability, and resiliency of the internet. And then just one last desperate plea for participate as soon as possible. And to those who feel that they are not part of the community, now is the time to become part of the community, and if there's a way we can facilitate that, we're happy to hear comments on how to do that.
Can I have a quick comment, and getting back to one of the questions around scope, because that's certainly been one of the fundamental issues that's rolled around this whole week. And you know, I made the earlier comments about timing. I believe scope has to be narrowly defined, or at least crisply defined. That said, even within scope, there are a range of issues as you unpack them that may take more consideration. And just as by way of example, in our community, in the country code operators community, accountability for IANA, not the broad accountability, but IANA accountability. For us as CC operators, we are somewhat different from the Gs in that we're not contractually bound with ICANN for the most part. We have very different governance environments. Some may actually be from government. Some are private corporations, a range in between. So issues around the delegation of the TLD, redelegation, revocation, those need to be very well understood. They need to be predictable. And the IANA function, the process around it, needs to be accountable for implementing whatever may happen around those subjects in a predictable way, a way that is consistent with policy and that is understood well in advance. So while I believe the scope should be narrow, it is going to start to include some thorny issues in and around IANA transition process, because those are truly existential issues for country code operators.
Very last comment from Valentina.
Thank you. I'll be short. I would just like to echo the fact that good processes and procedures do not guarantee good outcomes. So even if we have a perfect transition plan and perfect accountability for implementation and operational for technical functions, if we have bad policy, this does not lead us anywhere. So I would feel more comfortable if this this transition would look at the overall picture and have this all-inclusive approach, looking at all the different elements, because at the end it will impact us, the end users, the individuals, and if policy decisions do not take this into account, then I'm not so sure about the value of this transition.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to get out of here, but my first point of view is that we have to participate, and the sooner we do, the better, and the channels for participating are clear, so we should get involved. The second observation is that let's not make it more complicated than it is, and let's do our best to solve the problem as has been stated. So with that, I thank you very much for this first half session, and Matthew will take over from here.
Thank you, Nii. Matthew Shears with the Center for Democracy and Technology. So I realize that we have somebody standing here patiently waiting, so let me just give 1 minute introduction, then we can take your question, and then we'll go and let these panelists over here who've been very patiently waiting have a moment, and then we'll open it up again. I think the fascinating thing about this discussion is it reflects marvelously the layout of this table. So on the one hand over here we have the IANA transition, the clerical, the operational aspect, and over here we have the accountability. And yet when we hear the discussion, discussion just now, it inevitably falls into the accountability discussion. And I think that reflects one of the dimensions that's so complex about this and so difficult to grapple with, is that it's very hard to extract and separate accountability issues from the IANA transition. So just with that, and then if you want to go, and then we can keep your question in mind, and I'll just come to the panel, if that's all right.
So, I'm sorry, my question, my comment actually relates to the last discussion, if I may.
Yeah.
Thanks, Matt. So Yeah, hi, Keith Drazik. I work for VeriSign. I'm part of the ICG on behalf of the GTLD registries. I just wanted to comment on the term that's been used, deadline. There have been several folks who have said there is a deadline. There's a deadline that we all must meet. And frankly, it's not a deadline. NTIA has said that it is a target date and that there's the opportunity to extend the current IANA functions contract if the community is not able to come together around a consensus recommendation. So I'm going to echo the things that Joe and Byron and others have said to say it's time for the community to get involved. It's time for us to get to work and to work towards the target date. In other words, we need to make sure as a community that we're delivering on the expectations and the call from NTIA to come up with a consensus recommendation for the IANA functions and frankly on the interdependent, inextricably intertwined, interrelated ICANN accountability piece. Because if we don't, there is the possibility that the functions will be, the contract will be extended. So it's time for us as a community to come together and to make sure that we're working together to make sure that the recommendation is delivered in a timely manner. So I guess the call again, everybody get involved now, get involved in the community efforts to make sure that the recommendation is delivered on time. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, let me quickly introduce the other side of the table. We have Avri Doria, Internet researcher who's with ICANN, IETF, and Internet Society. We have Ambassador Benedicto Filho from the government of Brazil. We have Tuwela Nyirenda Jer from the NEPAD program in Africa. We have Teresa Swinehart from ICANN, and we have Paul Wilson from APNIC. And what I'd like to do is ask you very briefly to deal with the issue of what do we need to do, what do we need to see in place to ensure the accountability of ICANN going forward once the United States government steps back. And we've heard the issue of trust raised by panelists, by commentators, and if you could just address that, just very briefly, and then we'll open up to the floor. And I would echo all those comments so far that have said that we need to see more participation, so this is your chance. Please write down those questions, come to the mic, and let's have an interactive discussion. Thank you. Okay, Avri, if you could lead off.
Thank you. There's a concern that when the NTIA is no longer an authority that can reassign the contract, some future ICANN board may go rogue. Some point to the AOC and its ATRT, the affirmation of commitments as a solution, but the affirmation of commitments can be canceled by either party upon notice. It's been suggested that it can be added to the bylaws. But even if it is added to the bylaws, that hypothetical rogue board can remove it. And so it remains a concern. So there needs to be some other form of redress. Among the basics in democracy, when we talk about democracy, and if nothing else, multi-stakeholder, bottom-up approaches need to be democratic, is we pick our leaders, we recall our leaders, and we pick our own methods of governance. So, recalling the leaders, though, is much too big a hammer to use. It smashes the viability of the organization and for some period of time leaves it sort of dysfunctional. So it's a good solution, but it's not enough of a solution because it's one we don't want to use. Another form of binding redress is necessary, and I believe it is possible. People have rightly argued that the appeals board, which I had been championing for a bit of time, sort of puts us in could result in an infinite regression of accountability challenges. Who's accountable? Who is the appeals board accountable to, et cetera. I would like to suggest perhaps that we could establish a form of arbitration between ICANN and the ICANN organization and any appellant. That would bring up the issue of, well, how do you prevent spurious? And that I would think that we can use the ombudsman function to basically first try to mediate, to verify the validity of any claim, but then basically to be the one that would set up. There are many issues that would need to be talked about, such as how the arbitrators are picked and how the mechanism works, but I think this is a mechanism that can and should be explored by those that are responsible for finding a solution. Thanks.
Thank you, Avri. Ambassador?
Thank you. I'd like to, in regard to this issue, refer to Net Mundial, which has been extensively mentioned in the course of this meeting as a meeting that has set some standards, some understanding that you need to operationalize Net Mundial. And my point is that there are some very concrete recommendations contained in the Net Mundial statement which should be taken into account. So if I can refer to part 2 of the Net Mundial statement, issues dealing with institutional improvements. This issue, that discussion between the linkage between the transition process and accountability has been extensively discussed in the context of Net Mundial. And there are 2 portions of the document that deal with it. Paragraphs 5 and 6 of that second session. In paragraph 5, that could give the idea of a narrow approach because it refers to transparency and accountability should be part of the discussion of the transition in regard to those functions. So that leads us to the narrow approach. But on the other hand, paragraph 6 states that the process of globalization of ICANN should speed up, leading to a truly international and global organization serving the public interest with clearly implementable and verifiable accountability and transparency mechanisms that satisfy requirements from both internal stakeholders and the global community. And here we are clearly looking at a broader picture. Paragraph 6 is not exactly referring to the time frame we have been working in, so it might be argued that larger accountability should not be part of the exercise. But my point, and I will conclude because I see time is elapsing, is that 2 goals should be pursued here. One is to ensure a swift transition from the technical point of view that ensures security, stability, resilience. We are fully in agreement with that. But we should not forget that there is a not less important goal that should be to ensure that at the end of the process, the legitimacy of the organization, the perception of legitimacy is also enhanced, especially in regard to those that are not part of the discussion. And I think that would be a missed opportunity if we would have a very narrow focus, just focusing on the operational aspects and without having in mind a larger picture. I think Valentina has mentioned the larger picture. I think we should take, but maybe I would refer to the concept that was introduced by Manal, that we should look at a minimum set of requirements that should not be compromised and should be part of the package, and some other elements could be left for later on discussion, because otherwise that would be very messy. And in regard to the deadline, just to conclude, I think the deadline is very important. We are looking forward to working constructively towards it, but I do not like to have a rush decision just because of the deadline. I think it's better to wait a little longer if necessary, but to have a decision that will appropriately address both elements to ensure the stability, the perfect functioning of the technical operation, but also adding this new dimension of legitimacy and through accountability and transparency, and that would require certainly an independent mechanisms that need to be sorted out. Thank you.
Thank you. Tuwela, if you would. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I think I would echo the sentiments that are being expressed around accountability with respect to 2 different processes. On the one hand, you have accountability with respect to the IANA transition. On the other hand, you have accountability with respect to ICANN in general. And I think that it might be very instructive maybe to actually look at where these 2 converge and where they diverge, and make that very clear as we move forward so people can have a better understanding, but also to make sure that we are not looking at issues just within the context of the transition, which is a time-bound process, I think, and we're looking at the issues of accountability of ICANN overall. I think part of my other comments are really looking at issues in terms of From my perspective as a stakeholder, coming from Africa, from a developing context, I think that there are concerns around how we actually give a voice and make the process inclusive for those stakeholders that are coming from developing contexts. We talk a lot about people participating, about people contributing, but I think we also then need to understand what the preconditions are for people to be able to participate meaningfully and effectively. I mean, we assume that internet is available and accessible to everybody all the time, which it's not. And all these documents are online, all these conversations are happening online, which makes it very difficult for people who do not have effective and reliable access to actually participate. So I think we also need to maybe step out of our comfort zones a little bit and start to think about what does participation mean for somebody who perhaps may not enjoy the same access to technology that I have, but who is still an interested party and who is still affected by the issues that are being discussed. The issues of trust, I think, are also important, and I think that that's something that must also be looked at as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Teresa, maybe you could just give us an update where things stand, because there have been some changes and developments over the past week or so in terms of the accountability process that ICANN has in place, and perhaps it would be useful for the audience to understand where things are at the moment. Thanks.
Absolutely, thank you. I think that there's already been a wide range of really good remarks made on this topic, and I certainly wouldn't want to speak to what the outcome should look like. I think that's part of the process that needs to be taking place. Just to give a quick update of where things are on this, the process on the accountability, I think, has been touched upon, that the IANA stewardship transition is looking at the accountability actually among the contracted parties and their relationships there. The Enhancing ICANN Accountability process, which has been under discussion, is very much about the changing relationship. And I think for those who may have been at the workshop that was held earlier this week, you may have heard also NTIA reiterate that the process is interconnected with the transition, but its focus is really also on systemic issues caused by the changing historical relationship with the U.S., including, for example, stress testing solutions to safeguard against capture, both internal and external to the organization. So these are interesting issues and challenging issues, and I think very important for discussion. And there's potentially models and examples from other organizations that could cause some identification of best practices. On the process itself, the discussions have been ongoing since March. The model that is being put forth and has been discussed extensively is really seeking to be as inclusive as possible, to Tuala's point as well, in ensuring that it's a platform and mechanism that all can engage in, along with a similar concept of the coordination group to pull things together and to identify those. I think what's essential is that this process is open, it's inclusive, and that the results of it are really a consensus agreement on a global scale, and one that scales globally and is timeless. And we don't know where things are in 20 years, so there's quite a bit of hard work. Given community feedback also this year and the importance of this issue, this will go out for a last call or final sort of looking at by the community for a 21-day comment period, which we hope to have posted today or within the next few days, and then look forward to the final feedback on that. So that's where we stand right now, and I can certainly touch on other topics later.
Paul, perhaps you could, I believe you're on the ICG, if I remember correctly. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit, so you've heard a lot about some of the concerns about linkages and things like that. How do we, from your perspective, ensure that there is cooperation, coordination to reflect the interdependency of these issues, and how do we ensure that we bring in a greater number of interested parties into the process? And perhaps you could explain what the NRO's process is. Thank you.
Well, first, I think the processes, the IANA transition and the accountability question are very closely linked. ICANN was not required to open up its accountability process by the NTIA's announcement. It did so sort of voluntarily and at the urging of the community. And I think that's very good. The NRO, the RIRs, by the way, have followed suit. You know, we regard ourselves as being absolutely part of the system and part of the new arrangements. So what goes for ICANN in terms of increasing confidence and accountability goes for us just as much as a party to the arrangements, existing and/or new arrangements that are involved with the transition. Personally, I've found the accountability question to be really nebulous and difficult to get a handle on, particularly the sort of turtles on the backs of turtles kind of sense of accountability, who keeps the accountability structures accountable and so on. So I like to look at things from a practical perspective, and I think accountability is defined by a situation where one party has accountability to another party for something specific according to an agreement. Those parties in an agreement, of course, they are defined, and the thing that is the subject of the accountability is defined, and then the critical parts which really define accountability are things like reporting, determining deviations from the agreement, and what are the dispute resolution provisions. So in our case, RIRs, in our relationship with ICANN, the accountability is for the provision of IP addressing related services in compliance with policies, which are defined, under the agreement or referred to under the agreement, and there should be redress mechanisms, binding mechanisms for when that fails. And so, since I think the IANA transition is all about what are the new arrangements, what are the arrangements which will be in place, whether they're new or not, but what are the arrangements which will be in place after the NTIA sort of withdraws from the current arrangements. Those agreements should be where I think accountability is very, very clear. So the other sort of principles the principles that lie behind this, there's a definition, but the principles are really all about transparency of reporting and the clarity and certainty of the arrangements and the commitments that are made. There's a concept of independence, the presence of third parties in critical determinations, the ones I've mentioned, the audit, reviews and dispute resolution and so forth. The third party that everyone's very much aware of at the moment, in some sense, in an accountability sense, is the NTIA. But the third parties that are really needed are the ones that are specific to individual arrangements, and there may be quite a lot of them for third parties involved in specific arrangements under the new arrangements made. Other principles are reliability. The agreements that are made do need to be binding, and I think the dispute resolution is a critical part of that. They also need, I think it's very important, this comes back to the sort of security and stability of the IANA function as well, that these accountability arrangements need to be responsive. They need to be operating in, I won't say real time, but as close as possible to real time as we can make it. So I think what is critical in this environment is to have this open review of all of the arrangements. The accountability is one, but that's being reviewed in the context of this, the ICG's request for proposals for the specifics of the new arrangements which different communities want to make. And I'd just say again that it is a sort of two-way street, that all parties to these arrangements need to be accountable. So specifically, the NRO has published a comparative review of the accountability mechanisms across all five RIRs, and you can find that on the NRO website, where you can find out board procedures, policy development, dispute resolution, and so forth comparatively. And I think what follows that is, that's a comparative review, but what follows that would be a review of where individual RIRs might fake measures, which could be documentation or more sort of substantial measures to converge and make sure that, you know, our transparency and accountability across the board is kind of transparent as well and as clear as it needs to be. That's, I think, an ongoing process. It's never perfect, but it's something that we have launched quite deliberately at this time, and it'll continue. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Before we open this up to the floor and to the other panelists, by the way, I want to bring you in if you wish to. Were there any comments on anything that was said from the panelists on each other? Avery, you want to? Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on one thing that Paul just mentioned very briefly, and that's when he said that the ICANN had no obligation. And of course, that's right. Obligation being a very strong word. Yet the ATRT2 recommendations that were made to the board and that the board accepted included the recommendation that indeed such a process be created. So it's not that just sort of out of the blue with the NTIA proposals coming up, there was an accountability mechanism that was opened up. That was a specific recommendation of the ATRT2 that indeed they do exactly what they're doing. So I just wanted to bring that into the discussion.
Ambassador.
Well, we would not like to be guided in this process by a purely corporate approach to accountability. I think ICANN has a unique situation in which it manages a resource that is of global interest and should be doing this in the public interest. So I think the requirements of accountability from ICANN are substantially different from a private company. So I think the logic of a private company does not apply here. I participated in the town hall meeting, and I was very glad to see that the concerns we have are shared by the community. And there is, I think, a clear message emanating that in spite of the respect we have for the work that has been done in order to ensure transparency and the mechanisms, those are insufficient to deal with the concerns. It is insufficient to try to improve on this, to work on this, because those are intrinsically insufficient. Something else must be added to this. The limits, the scope, I think is something to be decided, but clearly that has to be inserted in the final proposal to be presented for transition. Otherwise, and again I repeat, there would be a missed opportunity, and the purpose of this whole exercise would be defeated, because in the end, the same situation in which ICANN is largely seen by those outside here, those that are not in the inner process, is largely seen as an illegitimate organization. So I think we have an opportunity to address this in a serious, in a collaborative way, in a multi-stakeholder format. We are comfortable in working that format. We look forward to that discussion on those terms. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, opening it to the floor. This is your opportunity to ask questions about the IANA transition, both the operational aspect that's being covered by the ICG and also the accountability aspects, or indeed broader ICANN accountability. So please come to the mic, and we look forward to questions. Just before you ask your question, please tell us who you are, and if you're directing it at someone in particular, please indicate it. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Igor Milashevsky. I'm from Russia. Let me speak Russian.
I'm speaking on my own capacity. The initiatives of the transition period have stimulated discussions on internet governance. And this is a very interesting and complex problem indeed. During the discussions, obviously, we were focused on the IANA contract. Why? Because, well, difficult problems require discussions of this sort. And in this contract, there are two parties. And a very important discussion indeed took place on the issue of accountability and transparency of IANA and ICANN. Obviously, this is important. But there could be another priority, the function of NTIA and the functions it fulfilled. What sort of functions were they fulfilling, and who should fill them now if these functions are, say, given to another party? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to address that? Anyone on the panel?
Sure, I can try. I think that's actually part of the discussion of these two processes in the context of the IANA transition, looking at how the stewardship role and the role of NTIA when it's being removed is going to be addressed in the context of the parties. And then in the context of ICANN's broader accountability, the stewardship function that the U.S. has played as a perceived backstop or existing backstop to a variety of areas. So I think my response to that is actually that is the purpose of these two processes, and thus it's very important to be engaged and participating in them.
Yes, please.
My name is Michael Rotet. I'm representing the German internet industry, and my question is, wouldn't it be easier for future discussions about accountability if there is a controlling body? I mean, ICANN is a global organization, the internet is global, so shouldn't be there a global controlling body to make it easier discussing accountabilities in the future?
I originally came up with proposals that did require that one, and did require some kind of controlling body. But if you're staying away from an intergovernmental, which has been mandated in something I very much agree with, the problem we have, and that's been pointed out to me several times, that I haven't been able to resolve, is how do you avoid the infinite regression of who is the overriding body accountable to, and how is that determined, and who are they accountable to? And I have not been able to come up with a solution to the regression of accountability. And that's why I've sort of been looking for other solutions and come up with the notion of binding arbitration of some sort, because then the people that are appealing are accountable to those they're appealing for, and ICANN is accountable to them, and then there just needs to be the proper choosing of an arbitrator. So I agree with you, but I can't solve the problem of infinite regression of accountability.
Very shortly, I won't speak to what the final solution looks like. I did just want to touch, there's been some reference to some of the existing accountability mechanisms, specifically what's referred to as the accountability and transparency review process. And I think in looking at all of this and trying to ensure we're focused on the specific issues, just to highlight that on the 22nd, we will be putting out how the implementation is progressing of the last round of the ATRT2 process, and this will provide some examples of the checks and balances and mechanisms that are being put into place specifically. Not that it's a solution for the topic we're addressing, but it may provide some additional things to look at on how things are being measured and implemented from an example standpoint.
Thank you. Malcolm.
Thank you. Malcolm Hutty from the London Internet Exchange again. I would like to identify one area which I believe is the most fundamental and the most urgent area of accountability to be addressed. That is the question of the scope and purpose of ICANN and its core values. The fundamental mission of ICANN and its core values are set out in the first two articles of its bylaws. If the bylaws may be changed by the board. If the board were to choose to change these two aspects of the bylaws, to whom would it be answerable? In practice, in a very real sense right now, the board would be answerable to the NTIA, because the NTIA decides to place the IANA contract, And it is only through the IANA contract that, at least in respect of the DNS GTLDs, ICANN policy can be given effect. So unless the NTIA can be at least content, can be at least broadly satisfied with the changes to those purposes, no ICANN board could conceivably make such changes in defiance of that will, knowing that it was ultimately in peril of being found an unsuitable organisation to carry out those functions. The mere presence of the NTIA in placing that contract and having that control is a key form of accountability that restrains the decisions that the board might otherwise be minded to make and sets the parameters within which such decisions are made. So it's not necessary to say for the NTIA to actively intervene, for it to have exercised a key form of accountability in this crucial area. When the NTIA steps back from this, who then is to hold the board accountable for those key questions? I would like to suggest that it is fundamentally urgent that we have good answers to that. Avri has just mentioned a key problem. How do you avoid the problem of infinite regression? The traditional approach to these sorts of things is to attempt checks and balances where different entities are responsible for different purposes. Here we have three things. The board is responsible for interpreting the bylaws and for changing the bylaws and really for deciding whether the bylaws have been broken. These are three separate areas that could indeed be split. And if they were, then you might find a route to solving that problem of infinite regression. I hope the community will give some thought to that in the intervening period. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. I'm conscious that we're absolutely running out of time. So I see we have, do we have a remote? Do we have a question from remote? No? We have two more questions, I believe. So can we take those questions? We'll do a quick roundup around the table. If any of the panelists want to make a last comment or address those questions, then we'll bring it to a close. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Pierre Bonis from AFNIC, the registry for .fr. A quick question about the accountability process. Will it end at the same time as the IANA transition process will end? And to whom the accountability team will submit its result? Only to the board, or to the board and the USG, or only to the community? It's not very clear for me. Thank you.
Could we take the last question? Thank you. And I apologize that we're not able to take more questions. Thanks for your understanding. Go ahead.
Hello, Paul Levins, outer board member and former ICANN staff member. It would be easier, in my view, to capture the election of the Pope than it would be to capture the election of the ICANN board. The NomCom process is so convoluted, so driven by community, that it would test the patience of any politician, terrorist or spy. So this concept that somehow there will be one day a massively rogue board that will do terrible things to the internet, I think is a bit of a furphy. The second thing that I wanted to talk to is that I don't think there'll ever be an accountability nirvana for ICANN. ICANN has always evolved, and it must always continue to keep evolving. You don't want a state where you say, that's it, it's done, transparency and accountability is finished for ICANN. You do not want that state. Finally, to the point about, the NTIA really holds the organisation accountable. This was a statement that was made about the JPA, so with joint project agreement, another contractual arrangement that that ICANN had with the NTIA. But during that process, in fact, in the dying days of that process, the NTIA made it very clear in public statement that the MOU does not give the Department of Commerce the ability to exercise oversight in the traditional context of regulation, and the Department of Commerce plays no role in the internal governance or day-to-day operations of ICANN. So I think good luck navigating the process, but trying to link the beginnings of this session and the latter session. Don't break the things that have worked well so far. Don't break those things. And demonstrably, over 15 years, this process has worked very, very well.
Thank you, Paul. Just checking with remote. No questions from remote. Okay. So we had 3 questions. How do we hold the board accountable? How do we put the proposal to the NTIA? And is an accountability nirvana desirable or even achievable? I don't know if any of the panelists want to touch on any of those 3 questions that we heard at the end, and then we'll quickly do a wrap-up. Avery.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on 2 of them. One of them is, no, I don't think we can solve all of ICANN's accountability problems, because indeed there are an infinite number and there'll be more in the future. But we do need to solve a certain number of them to get to the point where we can end in time. And in terms of the rogue board, I don't think so much in terms of capture, but in all my years of watching the ICANN board, I believe I do see a hive mind. And that as people enter the board, they start to think in a similar manner, and that is actually what could lead to the issues that I talk about. And it's only a hypothetical, but indeed it's that hive mind that I see in the board that sometimes does concern me.
Thank you, Avery. Anybody else want to touch on those questions? Okay. Yes, Teresa.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on some of the points that the last speaker, Paul Evans, had made. ICANN by design is an evolving and living organization, so stagnation is not a healthy thing for any organization in the context of the internet space, or any other space for that matter. And the bylaws and the review mechanisms, both the organizational review mechanisms and the review mechanisms through multi-stakeholder approaches reflected in the affirmation of commitments, are all intended there to ensure that there is a continuous review and incorporation of the changing environments, and to address specific issues that may arise in the context of capture or transparency or accountability or anything else of that matter, both internal and external to the organization. And so I think in the context of this accountability dialogue, really focusing on the issue at hand and recognizing that the organization and institution will, of course, continue to evolve regardless, and addressing the other issues at hand. But we do need to really look at what's at hand here in regards to the NTI transition, so we can achieve that in a good way.
Thank you, Teresa. Anybody else? Yes, please.
Yes, just very quick 3 points. I mean, one cannot decide on going by part of a thing without seeing the whole picture. So I believe we definitely need to see the whole picture of the accountability. We need to know all the components of the accountability, and then we need to decide on what are the prerequisites for the IANA transition and plan for the rest that might not be prerequisite. The second thing is that when we talk about meeting the deadline, or I'll call it the target date, if this is a better way to put it, this does not by any means compromising anything or rushing into a proposal. The proposal would go through many cross-checking with the NTIA criteria by the submitter, by the ICG, and ultimately, of course, by NTIA. So, and any failure to match the criteria is going to be failure to submit a proposal. So we cannot really submit a proposal that does not go by the criteria. And finally, how things would look like afterwards, I hope that this would be transparent from anyone. I mean, the success is because there was no complaint about the operation as it is right now, so I hope things would go smooth and it becomes transparent at the end that a transition has really occurred. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're going to have to...
5 more minutes. 5 more minutes, and then...
Okay, we have a couple of minutes, Grace. Ambassador, please.
I'll be very quick. Just to say that I appreciated very much the idea that was conveyed of separation of powers. I think that's an important notion, one that was also discussed in the context of Net Mundial, policy making, implementation, and also the assessment of accountability on those. We have to work hard, we have to work quickly. I'm confident and hopeful that the same energy that ICANN has been displaying in engaging in internet governance issues at large, beyond the scope of ICANN, recognizing the linkages of all those issues, will also be displayed in the context of the exercise at hand by recognizing that there are important elements. It may be formalistically outside the scope, but that should be included in order to enhance the legitimacy of the exercise. Thank you.
Okay, any panelists would like to make a last comment? Otherwise, we'll wrap this up. Just give a moment to Paul, as long as it's brief. Thanks.
Well, I hope so, yeah. In relation to the single point of accountability, I think we should remember the principle of subsidiarity in governance. It's a term that came up during WSIS, which refers to the location of solutions as close as possible to the problems and the communities that are affected by them. The IANA functions are divisible. They are largely entirely independent of one another, and they're an accident of history. And that bundling implies a sort of shared fate amongst all of the clients of those functions. And the NRO, for one, has been satisfied with that. We've been able to support it for reasons of convenience and so on. But I think that the numbers community does not want our dependency on IANA and its services to be thrown into chaos as a result of issues elsewhere. Trade disputes in the wine or cheese industries, for instance. I mean, the internet is much bigger than those things and much more important. So I think that is at the heart of the concern that I think we share about the stability, the certainty, and the security of IANA's functions and its future operations as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to the chair, and we'll conclude after his comments. Thank you.
Bugün buradaki oturuma katılarak konuyla ilgili görüş ve değerlendirmeleri.
We would like to thank each and every participant and panelist for being with us and for sharing their valuable thoughts. This transition period and ICANN's accountability process, I do believe that this session will be contributing to the transitional process. Before we close, we have a note. We have found a mobile telephone under our table. The person, whoever that is, who dropped the mobile phone, we would kindly ask the owner of the mobile telephone to contact me or to contact the security officer. Thank you very much.